Good evening, dear participants. On behalf of the Department of English, School of Sciences and Humanities, SR University, Warangal, I cordially welcome you all to today's evening expert talk by Dr. Audrey Southgate on the topic Open Translation, a case study of the Wycliffite Psalms. So I take this privilege in introducing today's speaker, the resource person of the day, Dr. Audrey Southgate. Dr. Audrey Southgate is a lecturer in Old and Middle English in Lincoln and Hertford Colleges at University of Oxford. Her research concentrates on medieval literature with a particular focus on psalm reception in late medieval England. In addition to her more formal academic work, she is involved in various initiatives that bring her research to the service of holistic education. These include Emmanuel Christian School in Oxford, where she contributes to curriculum development and delivery, and the Canterbury Institute, where she is a senior reader, convener of the Classical Education Reading Group, and a tutor on the Awakening Project. Dr. Southgate also composes poetry and was recently awarded a prize from Oxford's English faculty for her
Okay.
poem Saeculum. So, with this short note, I welcome Dr. Audrey Southgate for today's evening expert talk on open translation. We are indeed privileged to have you, Dr. Southgate. It's been quite some time that we've been conversing, and I met Dr. Southgate uh, at Oxford University online conference where ma'am was the chair of a session where I presented a paper. And it's been that we've been planning for this particular session from long, and it is actualized today. And with this short note, I ask you all to join me in welcoming Dr. Audrey Southgate. Over to you, Audrey Southgate. Dr. Southgate, you can unmute yourself. Yes, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Rupesh. It's a real honor to be joining you all, and I'm especially grateful to Rupesh for inviting me. And this fruit of, as you said, several months of conversing. How could we continue the conversation we were having at this conference back in April? Um,
Yes.
and just for reference, I don't know what all the participants here, what your fields are, what your focus is. Unlike a conference, it's not even that we're all here to talk about a particular thing. So I'm hoping that maybe when we get to the question and answer time, you'll very much feed in from your different fields. The work that I do is very interdisciplinary. Well, and I want it to be more interdisciplinary. I want to hear those different perspectives and thoughts from different areas of expertise. So I'm looking forward to that. Um, but I'll start by sharing what I have. Um, I don't know. Can people see? I I've tried to share my screen via coming in another way, and that has the PowerPoint on it. Maybe Rupesh can bring that up. Oh, perfect. Well, will you move things through then?
Yes, I'll do that. Yeah.
Great, super. That's wonderful. Lovely. So just to kind of to give a little bit of background information, um, I work on something called the Wycliffite Bible, the Bible translated probably not by the 14th century reformer John Wycliffe himself, but by followers inspired by him. And this is the first full translation of the Bible into English. Um, uh, it's worth noting it has that important reputation. There also were translations of parts of the Bible into English that pre-existed that from several hundred years before. But obviously, the English language has changed over the course of the centuries that it's been spoken. And so, in the late 14th century, the Old English versions of certain books that were available were no longer going to be legible, really, to English speakers. So people were using only the Latin translation that Jerome had made, called the Vulgate. And like I said, there hadn't been a translation of all the books anyway before. So this was quite a groundbreaking thing. We have about 250 manuscripts of the Wycliffite Bible, in a couple of different versions. Of those, we have about 40 copies that include the Psalms in some way, shape, or form. The Psalter was an especially popular book, really important to people at the center of the Bible. And I've gotten I've brought up on our next slide a picture of one of these Bibles. There, like I said, there are 250 of these, and each one is unique. Back in the days before you have manuscripts, before you have the printing press, each book has to be copied by hand, so each one is going to be sui generis, of its own kind. This is an example just of one opening of the Psalter. This isn't a particularly special manuscript in any way. It's large. It's like, this manuscript would be something where you'd actually need both hands to carry it. You can see that it's got a special illuminated initial, and you can see that it's got these little glosses in the margins explaining the text. You can see that the different different verses are marked out by colored capital letters, so that you could tell when a new psalm was starting and when a new verse was starting. That might be really useful for if you were reading the text aloud. And maybe if we just scoot to the next slide, we've got a picture of I've got a close up of that illuminated initial. Like I said, this isn't an especially pretty volume, but it's one of these things where if you look up close, you can actually see there's been an incredible amount of work that's gone into this. This initial is actually quite tiny, and you can see the fine work, the gold for the letter, and the fine pen work that you've gotten around it. If we just skip to the next slide, you can also see up close the work that's gone onto this. It's not just artistic craftsmanship. There is that, albeit of a simple kind. And you can see even more of this here with the pen work, but around that lovely W. But you can also see that there's been a lot of intellectual work that's gone into this. So it's going to be slightly funny handwriting if you're not used to reading 14th century scripts. But this is a gloss, and it's explaining what the meaning of this psalm is and actually the historical context of it. So someone has translated not just the text of the psalm, but also has gone to an authoritative exegete, a man named Nicholas of Lyra, and found out, what did he say about the psalm? What did he say it was about? What's interesting is there's actually several layers going on here, because Nicholas of Lyra had gone and consulted the rabbis and asked them what they thought the psalm was about. So you've got these layers of translation going on just in the margin of the text. This is just kind of a little, like I said, a core sample to just see how much work is going into the production of this text. But this isn't just important because it was a lot of work. Somebody in the 14th century thought this was really important. It was also really controversial in the 14th century. So in 1409, a couple of decades after this translation was produced, and we don't know exactly who produced it or exactly what year it came out. Again, we don't have the printing press. There's not a kind of mark that says 1380. This is we're publishing this book by so and so and so and so. Most of what we know about it is from scholarship looking back at the manuscripts that we have, like the one that I just showed you. So in 1409, an archbishop named Archbishop Arundel outlaws the translation. He says you're not allowed to circulate translations from the time of John Wycliffe or afterwards. And he explained part of why this is an issue, and that's on the next slide here. He says that the translation of the text of Holy Scripture out of one language into another is a dangerous thing. The Latin word that he uses is periculosa, a perilous thing, which I think captures some of the fear in this. It's a dangerous thing, as Blessed Jerome testifies. Jerome being the father, the church father who translated the Bible into Latin in the first place. And Jerome's reasoning for why it's a dangerous thing is this: it is not easy, and we can just keep the slide up for a moment longer. Sorry. It is not easy. If we can just keep the slide up, that would be great. Thank you. It's not easy to make the next one. Sorry. Perfect. Nope, the one before that. That one. Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. It's not easy to make the sense in all respects the same. So it's really difficult to translate the sense of Scripture. Is the concern that we have here. That it's a difficult thing, and therefore there's a concern about whether this is a good idea to do. Let's see. Now, this occasion, there's a whole set of debates that are going on in Oxford at the time about whether it's actually a good idea to be translating Scripture into English. And for some reason, this was an especially controversial thing in England. Lots of people are kind of curious, why would that be? Why wasn't this so controversial in France or Italy? But it was particularly controversial in England. Some of the different reasons mostly were to do with the difficulty of translating the sense. There's a concern that the English language didn't have the same capacity as the Latin language. So the Latin language has a very strict grammatical form and a lot of technical vocabulary. English, because it hadn't been used for scholarship, didn't have some of that technical vocabulary, and it didn't have quite as complex of a grammatical system, it was felt. So people thought it couldn't contain the same nuance that Latin could. And there was this concern that you might lose some of the divinely intended meaning in translation. So that's one issue, is the difficulty of translating the sense. The other difficulty is understanding the sense. So there's a difficulty of the English language. There's also the difficulty of the English people. And this one I think is in some ways quite sweet, sort of quite funny, and also slightly troubling, because there's this concern that English women in particular would be prone to heresy. And so that was another danger. English language, English people, we shouldn't have the Bible in English for them. So that was kind of a set of positions that was being argued in the university. On the other hand, you had people arguing for the value of translating the Bible into English. People in the university, but also trickling out of the university. And one of the texts defending the value of biblical translation is actually a text that gets stuck at the beginning of several Wycliffite Bibles. Whether it was actually produced by the translators and its exact relationship with the translation is a little bit unclear. But like I said, it does get attached to a number of them. So it's a defense of the circulation of the Wycliffite Bible for sure. If you look at the next slide that I've put up, you've got this this defense. You can look in the bit and bold in the end that the lewd, that is the lay people, the non-clergy, cry after Holy Writ, to Holy Scripture, to cun it, to know it, and to keep it with great cost and peril of their life. So there's this kind of rousing call to the value of putting Scripture in the language of the people, and it's grounded in Scripture. So it begins, this particular passage begins by quoting that moment in the Gospel where Christ is coming into Jerusalem, and the people are crying out Hosanna, and the Pharisees say, why are you letting them do this? And Christ says, the very stones would cry out if they weren't crying this out. And so there's this reading of that passage saying, actually, the Pharisees there are our clerks who say we can't, our clergy who are saying we can't have the Scripture in our language. They're like those Pharisees. We're like the people crying out Hosanna to Christ. So there's that reading of themselves onto the scriptural narrative, and you have this also with several in that in this work of defense of the value of scriptural translation. You also have a number of psalms being quoted that are being read as prophecies of this moment. Part of what's interesting about this is actually that those same passages are the same ones that the opponents of translation also quote. And I think I mentioned this to give you another little bit of a core sample of scholasticism, where everyone's using the same source text, the same proof texts to make different arguments, but you have to have the Bible and Augustine and several other sources are your shared authorities, and you all want to have the authority with you. So you're all quoting the same things towards your different arguments. And it's quite an interesting phenomenon if you read those and trace that out. Now, this is all in some ways all sort of set up to what kind of translation is this that we're producing? And I think one of the things that's interesting is that in that general prologue, that defense of translation, we have a statement not unlike Archbishop Arundel's of the difficulty of translation. So if we flip to the next slide. Thank you. Right, so here we have this statement that that the best translating is out of Latin into English to translate after the sentence and not only after the words. So you might have heard of this word versus sentence translation. And then we have this line, so that the sentence be as open or opener in English as in Latin, and not go far from the letter. And if the letter may not be followed in the translating, let the sentence ever be whole and open, for the words ought to serve the intent and the sentence. Otherwise, the words are superfluous or false. Now, this is, like I said, this is partly interesting just because it's an acknowledgement of the difficulty of translation that was stated by the opponents. Again, you have this, both sides have to acknowledge the same things, but then you turn it towards your own argument. In the case of the general prologue, it's turned towards, okay, then we need to make a certain kind of translation that addresses that difficulty of getting the sense in English. And I'm going to apologize. My office is right on the high street, so that was just one of many ambulances that will probably pass while I'm speaking. So the importance of the sense being open. Now, what does this word open mean? On the one hand, it seems to be associated with sense translation, and even today, if you're familiar with debate in the field of translation studies, translation theory, there's kind of this idea is, okay, are we trying to be faithful to the original text? Is it a word for word translation, where we're mostly focused on that? Or are we trying to get this, are we mostly trying to focus on getting this to an audience? Are we focused on getting the sense to this new audience? And I think that that this kind of this normative statement that you have here is really doing both. So on the one hand, it's entering into a rhetorical convention that goes back to Jerome, that translator of the Bible into Latin, and actually even before him. It goes back into the classical tradition, this rhetorical convention of whenever you present a translation saying, oh, I don't want to commit the fault of a faithful translator and only translate the words and not get the sense across. So that's just something that every medieval translator does based on that classical precedent. But I'm going to argue in as I speak today that it's actually a much deeper and more deeply embedded commitment to the audience that we have going on here, making sure that the audience gets to participate in understanding the text. At the same time, I think it's also articulating a deep commitment to a certain stance about revelation. There's a deep commitment to this idea that there is a sense to scripture that actually transcends the particular words, the letter. So what's in the same sense that you have in Hebrew could also be the same sense that you have. It could also be conveyed in Latin, could also be conveyed in English. And this is something really significant in Wycliffe's philosophy, actually, as well as his hermeneutics, is this idea that there are different layers to divine revelation. There's divine revelation as it exists in eternity, as it exists in God himself, as it exists in God's mind, as it exists in our mind, and finally, as it exists on the page. And the kind that exists on the page actually can be transferred not only from one page to another, if you were copying out a manuscript, but also can be transferred from one language to another. So we might think of these two commitments to the audience, to the sense, and the commitment to divine revelation, to the words of Scripture, as being in tension. But I think we'll see. I'll try to give some specific examples of how those actually speak together. There's a productive tension going on there in this translation project. Okay, so first of all, we have in the translation itself, and I've given just an example on the next slide, just so that you can see. This is just a verse from the translation. You can see it's actually, this is definitely not the modern translation. The message here, we're just completely doing its own thing. It is following the Latin word order very closely, but I won't go into that in too much detail now. If we can skip along to the next slide, we have a line here describing, this is all from the general prologue, this kind of defense of the value of scriptural interpretation and this articulation of what it might look like. We have this this kind of defensive line that if I haven't translated this openly enough, no doubt those who understand the sense of scripture and who understand the English language and have God's grace to help them, will travail with God's grace about it, might make the Bible as true and opener in English than it is in Latin. So I think here we have an invitation to audience participation in the sense of allowing the audience not only to participate in reading and understanding the text, but in translating the text. This is not we've done the once for all translation and that's it. There's almost an invitation here to keep an ongoing process of continuously translating the text, continuously improving the translation of the text. I think that's fascinating, especially given the Wyclifites' own position, of course, as people who are being challenged on their translation of an existing authoritative translation. But also their position, they're often called forerunners to the Reformation, and that's quite a complicated thing to ascribe to them. But it's also true that theirs was not the authoritative translation to English. I think they would have been really glad that there were later translations, and so many of them, that there would be this continuous work of translation. In the next slide, I have another quotation that just gives you a sense of, in this general prologue, how detailed it gets about the different ways of translating the sense. So it's almost as if it's giving, if not a blueprint for how to make a translation, it's sharing its logic in such a way that if you were making a translation, whether of the Bible or of another important text from Latin into English, you might follow this, you might be able to get some inspiration from this. So it's giving a bit of direction there. And in the so that's just a kind of to give the sense of the idea of the translation being something that that you're invited to participate in. But even if you don't sit down and make your own translation, there's this aspect of audience involvement in reading the text that is, in a sense, making every reader into a translator. So if we look at the next slide, I've got a bit of a chart where you have all these, they're called synonymous variants, where often they'll translate a word, and if you look in the far right column, translating a word and then offering an alternative translation and underlining it so you can see, okay, we only need one of these. But for instance, signs or banners, or veer time. Veer is an old-fashioned word for spring, so they had veer time or springtime. So just using synonyms so that if you were reading, you could choose which one you wanted. On the following slide, I have something even more interesting. This is some of my favorite examples are where you have basically you have a little mini Latin lesson in the translation. So this is Psalm 144. Generation and generation shall praise thy works, and they shall pronounce thy power. So in the Latin, we have the word pronunciabunt. This just means pronounce. And you can see, I mean, if you look at it, our word in English, pronounce, is very similar to the Latin word pronunciabunt. In fact, it comes from the Latin, and it's possible that it's the Wyclifite Bible that brings it over. A lot of words, when they're making their translation, they bring a lot of words over into English from Latin. But what's interesting here is it's not just pronounced by itself. if they are making a new English word from pronunciabunt, they're also offering a kind of more broken down translation where they're saying, okay, well, in Latin, pro means for, and nuncia means tell. So tell for, fourth, or tell for. So they're kind of breaking it down so you could see, okay, this is what the Latin words mean. And then this is kind of an English word based on the Latin. So I can choose one of those, but I can also use one to help me understand the other. And then in the very next verse, you have the same thing, magnificentia. Magne, well, magnificentia, there's that cognate that we have even in modern English, magnificent. And again, one of the first uses is from the Wycliffite Bible, so it may be that this is the first bringing over of that term from Latin into English. But there's also next to it breaking it down, magne, magnus, great, ficentia, doing, great doing, magnificence, great doing. Let's keep both of them. So you can see again that you participate in breaking down the Latin as you read this translation. And there's an interesting quote in the next slide from a translator that inspired the Wycliffites named Richard Rolla. When they and well, basically another Wycliffite text explaining how they've written their translation, and they say, in this work I seek no strange English, but easiest and commonest, and such that's most like to Latin, so that those who don't know Latin by the English may come to many Latin words. So I think we have this articulation here that that the translation could be teaching people Latin so that they could understand the text for themselves. Again, perhaps implicitly also so that they could make a translation for themselves. Right. Another kind of way that readers end up being involved or invited to participate in the translation is not just in the how do we make the Latin into English, but actually in the choice of what is the right version of this text. So the Psalter is a particularly interesting example of this because when Jerome translated the Psalter, he translated it several times. He translated it from the Septuagint, and there are two translations from the Septuagint that are attributed to him. One of them is called the Gallicanum, and that's very commonly used in the Middle Ages, very common in the liturgy. But he also translated the Bible from the Hebrew. He went back and had a second crack, or another crack from the Hebrew. And that's not as commonly used in the Middle Ages, but it is used a little bit in scholarship. And what's interesting to me is, as they're making their translation, the Wycliffites seem to be comparing the Gallicanum, that more common liturgical text, with the Hebraicum made from the Hebrew. And sometimes in their translation, you'll have these alternatives of that kind too. So in the next slide, we've got Psalm 44. God, thy seat is into the world of worlds, into ages of ages, world without end. The yard or the staff of thy room or kingdom is a yard or staff of right ruling. And then we have underlined, and it's usually underlined in the manuscripts too, either of equity. And you can see how equite there comes from the Hebraicum equitatis. So either right ruling or equity. And you can see that those are kind of synonymous, but also one of them is coming from one version, another is coming from another version. So it's leaving to the reader the work, some of that scholarly work of breaking this down. And in the next slide, I have another example of this, actually not just going back to the Hebraicum, but going back to the Vetus Latina, which is before Jerome made his translation, there was an old Latin version. So again, and the Wyclifite seems to be getting access to this by Augustine's commentary on the Psalms. So there's so much work going into this, so much scholarly work that's being made accessible in this translation. It's not just the biblical text, it's also these traditions of scholarship, and people are being invited, readers are being invited to use those. Okay, you'll be pleased to hear I have several different kinds of audience participation, but I'll go over them in slightly less detail in this whistle-stop tour. So we also have, I would say, an invitation for the audience to participate in terms of interpreting the text. So as you read the text, you're part of translating it, rendering it from Latin into English, but also understanding what does it mean. Um, not just in the level of how do we put this in English, but what is it significant exegetically? And if we go to the next slide, we have another quote from the general prologue, which again asserts the possibility that you can have an even more open exposition of the Bible in English than in Latin. And I think that this is speaking to a culture in which all the scholarship is happening in Latin. And there's this seed of a hope here, a little aspiration that perhaps there could be some exposition of the Bible in English. That scholarly work could be happening in English. We also have in the next quotation a line suggesting maybe also teaching and preaching. And this is about the Psalter in particular, which is kind of elevated as the book that's a digest of all scripture and that contains within itself, in short, what the rest of the scripture contains at greater length. So in the end of it, sort of praise to the Psalter, the general prologue says, God give us grace to live well in charity, and to say it, the Psalter, devoutly, and understand it truly, and teach it openly, we have that word again, openly, to Christian men and Jews, and bring them thereby to our Christian faith and burning charity. Now, I find this is one of the oddest quotes in this whole general prologue, because like I said, we have openly coming up again, teaching it to Christian men and Jews. Now, this is interesting because there's this whole debate at the time. Can you believe in the Messiah just from the Old Testament, just from the Hebrew Bible? Or do you need the New Testament to believe that Christ is the Messiah? So it's possible that this is referring to that debate and suggesting, okay, if you taught the Psalter would teach you about Christ as the Messiah. So that's why it needs to be preached to Jews. Maybe that's what it's suggesting. But the very reference to Jews is interesting to me because the Jews had been expelled from England in 1280. So, or 1180, more than 100 years probably before the Wycliffite Bible is being translated. So I don't know how they're envisioning what preaching to Jews in English, but it's just a very interesting line to have here. But we have this implication that people need to be able to understand the meaning of Scripture. Now, at some level, this gets actually imbricated into the translation itself. So in the next couple of slides, I have some examples where there's a word that they translate literally, like pusillanimite, littleness, and that's being read as meaning dread or fear. So littleness of spirit would be fear. Similarly, in the next quote, the idea of talking about people's arms, that's being read figuratively as referring to strength. And then in the next slide, I have yet another example where you have the word hand or hand being interpreted as power. So if you can see how they're seeing a kind of a figurative significance in each of these words that needs to be unpacked, and that's being made accessible in the Bible itself. But also, if we went back, we don't have to do this in the PowerPoint, but if you went back and remember that gloss that I showed you at the beginning, that you have these marginal glosses making scholarly interpretations accessible to readers of the Wycliffite Bible. Now, there's a bit of a challenge here, because how do you know what the open sense is? And I have a quote, the next quote on the slide, that just describing the different senses of Scripture. That in the Middle Ages you had the sense that there were there's a literal sense of Scripture, something like in that last example, the hand, that's the literal sense, the historical sense. But then it might have a figurative sense, like hand meaning power. It might have a specifically Christological figurative sense, so it might refer to Christ. But it might also have a sense referring to the afterlife, to eschatology. It might also have a figurative sense referring to the moral life, to living ethically. So the idea that the same word could mean multiple things at the same time. And it's not like it's either hand or power. It's that it can mean all those things at the same time. But how do you know um, what the figurative sense is? Um, and so this is the quote that I had pulled up here. Um, these ghostly or spiritual or figurative senses aren't authentic or to be believed unless they are grounded, and here's the word again, openly in the text of Holy Scripture in one place or another, or an open reason that may not be um, uh, disproved, or when the gospelers, gospel writers, or other apostles take the allegory of the Old Testament and confirm it. So, how do you know if your figurative reading is truthful? If you find it somewhere else in Scripture, um, if you can have it in your reason in a way that can't be disproven, or if some other Scripture writer says this is a figurative interpretation. So something like Paul saying this is how he interprets Sarah and Hagar, that's a big clue. Okay, so you have that grounding. I think there's a suggestion here of at least two different kinds of openness. And I want to come back to now to how might we define that term open. On the one hand, there's a sense that it has to do with perspicuity, or the obviousness. So the obviousness of Scripture, the obviousness of your reason, the fact that someone else is going to say, yeah, I follow your line of argument. And for this reason, you need to share your line of argument, kind of like in the modern day sciences, where we have this idea of reproducibility. You need to reproduce, someone else needs to be able to reproduce the same argument and get the same conclusion, whether by reason or from Scripture. So that's one sense of openness. But I think there's also a sense of openness which is to do with open-endedness, that we can have multiple things at the same time. And they could, more than one thing could be true at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. The last thing is thinking about, and this is a final sense of openness, and our very last slide, I think the next one. Perfect. That there needs to be an openness to what Scripture could do to us. So this is the Wycliffite general prologue, basically channeling Augustine and saying, okay, even if you whatever else, there's one thing we know is always the meaning of Scripture that you can't get wrong. And this, I'm going to read this out, the whole thing, because I think it's just beautiful and I think it's really apt. In whatever you understand in Scripture, charity is open. That is, it's obvious. In that whatever thou understandest in Scripture, and in what you don't understand in Scripture, charity is hidden. So what you do understand in Scripture, that'll be obvious charity. Charity is open to you. Whatever you don't understand in Scripture, actually, it's still charity that's hidden in there. Therefore, he that holds charity in virtues or in good conditions holds both that is open and that is hid in God's words. So the fail-proof meaning of Scripture is always going to be charity or love. And this is I think a lovely note to end on, the idea that interpreting or translating Scripture isn't just a matter of translating from Latin into English. It's not even just a matter of translating the meaning of Scripture out of the words. It's also a matter of translating that meaning into your living, and that meaning is always going to be charity. So your translation, at the level of the words, at the level of the sense, the interpretation, and at the level of living, will only be right, and you can be sure that it's right if it's to do with charity. So that's my sort of parting shot on the kind of audience participation, textual and lived, that the Wycliffites offer in their biblical translation. With that, I think I'll open it up to questions, but I'm going to let Rupesh kindly moderate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Southgate. It was really great to listen to you, and we could understand the kind of research that you have done in terms of learning Middle English and then the whole laborious work that you have done. At some point, when you spoke about the Bishop Arundel, who
Mm.
speaks about translation, I was reminded of uh, one of the articles one of my professors has written, where he talks about the impossibility of translation. The
Yes,
impossible,
yes.
yeah. So I would like to read that for you. We translate in the full knowledge that we cannot translate.
Mm.
We might even say we translate because we cannot translate. Every translator is a martyr killed one way or the other in the conflict between two texts. Yeah. So yes, I
It's an
was reminded
ongoing
of,
issue. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
No,
yeah,
nothing
yeah,
has changed in the last 700 years that way.
yeah. Very true, very true. So even when we wanted to translate these days from one language to other, India being a diverse
Mm.
nation with so many languages, and there is a lot of translation work which is actually going on. Yeah, and then we have this conflict always, the literality and taking the words in the context.
Mm.
Yeah, there is always a
Yeah.
conflict. Yeah, and this is very apt, I think, what you spoke and what I just referred to. Yeah, so now I think the floor is open for discussion. If you have any questions, uh, audience, please unmute yourself and you can ask your question. If not, you also can post your question in the chat box. Somebody has unmuted. Parvez. Okay.
I mean, so
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's one question.
yeah.
Uh,
Can I?
Kindly provide some information about cultural manipulation theory.
I wonder if someone could, if you could kind of expound on that question just a little bit, so I can kind of know what direction to take it.
Okay.
I've
Yeah. So this question is from, yeah, you can unmute yourself and you can ask the same question. Whoever, whoever has posted this
Hello.
question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Bianca.
Yeah, actually, I want to know about the cultural manipulation theory, which is propounded by Andrew Lacker and Susan Bassnett. So, what is cultural? What is the role of culture in that? How they are manipulating it? Cultural related word. How we are translating from one text into another text. So how it took place by the translator. So, I just want to know that matter.
yeah. So thank you so very much. And I will do my best to answer. I have to admit, as with speaking, because I don't know where each person's academic background, I don't want to be um, either sort of telling you what you already know or giving you a whole bunch of information that doesn't have context. That's because both of those things are quite frustrating. So I'll throw this into the ether and you can come back and say, that's actually not what I was asking at all, and that will be fine. One thing that's interesting with this particular translation um, is just, so it ends up actually being very close to the original text. And I think, so very close to the Latin. Like I said, there are all these um, alternatives that are provided that you could kind of add to, but I think there's an incredible respect for the audience that you have in that. Um, so rather than saying, well, our audience is like this, so we need to completely change the text to make it accessible to them, there's a real effort to actually keep it very close to the original, and then to give the audience the tools to work with those challenges. So okay, to take two steps back, if you know that translation is difficult, and you know that one of the reasons is that you don't actually know what text you're supposed to be translating, what's the authoritative version of the Bible, reason why it's difficult is, well, the English language has all this ambiguity, so you're not sure which word to use. And another reason is that the English language doesn't have vocabulary for that term. The idea that what I'm seeing in this translation, what I hope I've drawn out, is that there's this process of not just kind of high-handedly saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. If people, this is what's going to make it accessible enough to people, but actually giving people access to, these are the different versions that you would need to adjudicate between. These are the different English vocabulary words that you could use and choose from. These are the different meanings of this Latin word that we could pull out. These are the different figurative senses that you could work out and adjudicate between. But then, like I said, having a baseline, okay, well, we always know with scripture, it's interesting because, at least in the medieval Christian perspective, scripture always has one meaning, and that's Christ, and that's love, which is Christ. And so it always needs to be meaning that. Now, that doesn't really help you very much at the practical level of how do you translate Psalm 44, verse 7, but it's kind of your constant guideline. And it might speak to this, I found the quotation that Rupesh shared incredibly evocative, and I actually would love for you to send that to me, by the way. But also, and you could kind of feel like despair, like why bother translating? And yet, there's something important about it. There's something important about trying to bridge that gap, which, even though you'll never do it perfectly, and I think somehow that the effort to bridge the gap is some form, hopefully, some form of charity. It can be a form of manipulation of trying to change your culture, but you hope that it's also a form of loving your neighbor. And so, yeah, that would be worth doing for that reason. I just find it interesting that then the explanation of what it means would also be charity, but that's kind of that's the core of all this. I don't know if that answered your question at all, so please feel free to come back, and I will continue wittering on.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, may I?
Yes.
Ma'am, may I? Am I audible? Hello?
Please do. Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Please do. Yes,
Thanks. Madam, you have delivered a wonderful lecture on translation of the Bible. Actually, I am also interested in some sort of translation. Actually, I have done it myself, 2 or 3 texts till now. So one question, since you are a specialist in translation, my question is that when we translate a particular text of a region, a particular text of a region to another language, and that that particular text may contain certain words which are untranslatable.
Yes.
These are indigenous words of a particular region and which are untranslatable. Then should I add some notes on the untranslatable words for the readers to understand, or is there any other technique to do that? That's my question, ma'am.
I mean, this is such an interesting question. I could ask you just as well as you're asking me, because yeah, it's the translation is an art, isn't it? It's like, I think I tried to draw out a little bit. There's a constant evolution to the process of translating, because it may be that as you translate something, you're finding yourself, it ends up bringing vocabulary into the new language, and then that ends up developing its own associations. Yeah, so I mean, what I've described here with these authors is exactly what you've just said, where kind of bringing it over, just using the same word, but then offering a gloss on it.
Okay.
And actually, kind of an etymological gloss. But of course, it depends what kind of translation you're producing. So, with the Bible translations I've looked at, actually, the Wycliffites don't just translate the Psalter once. I've looked at mostly the one that gets circulated the most here, but actually they ended up producing several translations for different purposes. So if you were to be praying through the Psalms, you don't actually want these glosses that interrupt you. You just want to kind of say that you just want to have it run smoothly. Whereas if you're studying, you want lots more kind of interpretive material so that you can make sure you're getting a fuller fuller understanding of the complexity of the text. If that, so I think if I were making a translation, and it's been a while since I've done a translation, and I haven't done it from any really more obscure languages or more lesser known languages. I think you have to start by asking, what's the purpose of this translation? Who's it for? What are they going to use it for? Are they going to be, is this poetry that they're going to be reading aloud, in which case we don't want it to be interrupted by all these explanations? Or is it, is it for a scholarly thing? Is it, that's always and to some degree, the purpose has to determine your method, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, what have you found? I'd be interested to hear what you found helpful and what you found works.
Yeah.
As a practitioner.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, this is Rohit here. I'm a PhD research scholar. Loved your session. It was really phenomenal. So thank you for the session, ma'am. So I have two questions. One is related to the history, because when we were in the times when we were doing graduation, there was a lot of talk about the translation of the Bible, of how the clergy people misread the Latin and created their own perception and favored the kings, queens, etc., and had their own kind of text around it. And then when it was translated to English, English was considered vulgar. When the invention of vulgar word happened, I think, when the Bible became English. So if you could talk about that. And the second thing is, ma'am, so we, especially in our state, in the state of Maharashtra, which I am there, we have to compulsory, have a presentation in international conference. So Oxford is something that we've all, bred, and we hail that kind of a university. It's the best ever. So if you could tell us an authentic paper presentation, especially related to literature, I think it would help all of us to do that, whether it's online or physical, whatever. That would be really helpful, ma'am. So these are the two things.
So sorry, so the first one was
related to the translation from Latin to English, especially in the Middle Ages, where the clergy people ruled, UK and Europe.
Yeah, and then I didn't quite. Sorry, it was the second one. I didn't quite understand the.
The second, ma'am, it's like anywhere conferences or something that is happening in University of Oxford that I could present there somewhere. That'd be really a great thing.
Okay, I see. So just on the second one first, it sort of depends what you're working on, because the thing with Oxford is it's a university with a lot of incredibly specialized things going on. So I came here from the US. I'm originally from the States, and when I did my undergrad, we had a very like I had what's called a liberal arts degree. I think you have those liberal arts institutions in India too, where it's kind of a holistic education where you study, I did calculus and physics and English and philosophy and music, I did everything. And I love that. And I think it's really, really valuable, that kind of being a well-rounded person. The English university system is incredibly specialized. So, I came here to do English, and everyone I was doing English with had already specialized in medieval English. So I had to learn Old and Middle English very quickly. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for interdisciplinary work. And I think that's in terms of what I think the intellectual life is about, I think that's really important, not to just kind of cordon ourselves off. And this is part of why I'm so grateful to Rupesh for inviting me here. At the same time, if you were coming to a conference here, it would probably be for a specific topic. So you'd have to tell me what your topic is, and that might give me some ideas.
Right. So my basic topic is study of character through the lenses.
Okay.
Adaptation. So being translated, this is the main thing that I'm doing.
Okay. Okay. Well, if I come across anything that's about that, I mean, that sounds really valuable and important, by the way. Someone to keep an eye out for would be Alistair McIntyre. He's actually based at Notre Dame in the States on that one. But I ended up writing actually about the idea of character and the idea of ethics in my doctoral thesis. And the idea of ethics is not just a set of principles to live by, but as kind of that living out that I mentioned at the end of this talk. And this applies to texts too, that it's not just something in a book, it's actually something that ends up needing to be lived out in life. So yeah, that's obviously, that will be specific to you and to each person here, each person's specific topic. But if I come across anything, I will very gladly share it. To the first question about the context, yeah, I mean, just it's tricky because, like I said, it's easy to kind of make almost a bit of a straw man and say basically before the Reformation nobody read the Bible in their language, and afterwards, magically Martin Luther made that possible. I mean, and this is not to undermine the value. I mean, Luther's it was a what do you call it, a pivotal point. Well, yeah, it was a watershed moment, the Reformation, for sure. But like I said, King Alfred the Great, this is in the 800s, has, well, we don't know whether he actually sponsored the translation, but there's a translation of the Psalter attributed to Alfred the Great. You have other vernacular versions of parts of Scripture. But you also have, and this is particularly true in France, you have versions of the Bible that exist as kind of pictorial Bibles, such that you could see the stories, and not just the stories, not just the actual. For me, I think you wouldn't be able to find out the whole story from the pictures, but if you knew the story in advance, you would look at that picture and you'd think, okay, this is making an interpretive point about this picture. So you have those that are, in a way, that's really transcending languages, just using pictures. So I guess what I'm just trying to say here is, I don't want to create a kind of a stereotype that the Roman Church didn't kept every layperson from knowing anything about Scripture. And yet there was this, I think, this feeling of being threatened, that if people have access to the Scripture in their own language, they'll come up with interpretations, and some of those interpretations may be wrong. So yeah, and or they may be, it may not just be the interpretations are wrong. That takes away our hegemony for deciding how we interpret it. And if we want to say something different, then people can challenge that. So yeah, I mean, someone mentioned kind of cultural manipulation. There's definitely a power play that goes on when you interpret Scripture, because especially if it is the authoritative text. Yeah.
There are a couple of thank you. Yeah, there are a couple of questions. There was one question on how do we differentiate between the machine translation and the translation that we do. So.
Okay, so I mean, by the way, we're now taking me firmly out of my comfort zone, okay? Because I'm not really a translation theorist. I'm a literary scholar. That's my training. But so I have to admit, I'm terrible with computers. So I don't know very much about machine learning. I think that this is a really interesting question, because you now have this phenomenon where you can translate things on Google. It doesn't always do a great job. I can tell you it does not do a great job with Latin, but it's getting better. And it's the sort of thing where you have to believe that eventually it will get better about getting a technically correct translation. But I think I kind of want to go back to that, to the quotation that Rupesh shared earlier, where there's a sense of almost the translator making himself a sacrifice of being willing to be wrong for the sake of bridging this gap. And that's something that I'm not sure that machine learning can. There can't be that aspect of love or that ethical dimension to it. Yeah, and I do think that's really important. I mean, especially if you could mistranslate something, and with Scripture, this is obviously really important. where someone, if you get it wrong, you could be really misleading something about eternal things. You know, whether you're religious or not, you can understand that would be a significant issue in most religions. I mean, in some religions, I think the only one that I can think of actually would be Islam. You're not actually supposed to translate the scripture, presumably in large part to do with the very difficulty of this issue. And I think then if you offload it onto a machine, if there's any problem, who's culpable? Or who has responsibility? But also I think there's the aspect of it of to translate anything we translate, it's going from one mind to another. And it's going through the human being. And we're almost digesting it. There's this lovely medieval imagery of meditating on something as rumination, that you chew it. You're chewing the cud like a cow chews the cud. You're chewing a thought. And I think translation, any of us who have done any translation, it's a very different way of getting to know a text. Trying to figure out how am I going to put this in my language, or indeed in a different language that isn't my language or my original language. So I mean, I'm very thankful for machine learning and the way that you can, you know, if you're in a different country, you can communicate, or you can have access to text that you might not otherwise be able to understand, certainly not as quickly. But I think that there's something really important at a human level about this process of chewing the text by a translation, and I guess thinking of it as part of the interpretive, part of the process of understanding, which, like I said, connects somehow to then living that out in love. Which I wish a computer good luck with that last part.
That
Hi,
was
Dr.
really
Henry.
great.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Hello, Dr. Henry. So this is Narsumareddy from Hyderabad. So my question to you, it is not about the translation. So I am from the industry background. I will not ask the particular translation. So as far as your understanding is concerned, what lessons about duty and moral responsibility can be drawn from the divine intervention of Bible? Please, can you light on this?
I'm not sure I quite understood the question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it is what is your understanding about the lessons from the Bible about duty and moral responsibility?
Duty and moral responsibility.
Yeah.
Great question. I mean, Proverbs is absolutely wonderful for this because it will often have, you know, answer a fool in his folly, don't answer it, you know, that he may become wise, and then don't answer a fool in his folly lest you be like him. Right next to each other, you've got what seems like opposite advice, and you're having to kind of trace back to, well, what's the wisdom behind this? Something might be wise in one situation and not wise in another. That's not saying that everything is relative, but that you have to live ethically, to live morally. You have to basically, and I think this comes back to that question of character that came up a little bit earlier. You have to have wisdom and rightness within yourself that can then be lived out in what might even be opposing situations. I think the Psalms are actually really rich for this too. And I think, I mean, my understanding would be that something like the Psalter, which is a book that's that something like the Psalter actually kind of tells us about what our internal life should be, from which to then make those wise decisions in particular moments. I'll take a couple steps back. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm sorry if I go on for too long. I'll try and keep it short. There's in the Middle Ages, and I think that they're really apt with this. There's this special association between the Psalms and the Ten Commandments, and even to this day, theologians will connect the Psalms to the Torah. Now, some of this comes from the etymology. Psalter, the book of Psalms, comes from the Greek psaltery, which is an instrument which has 10 strings. Medieval people love finding those figurative spiritual interpretations, like I said before. And so they think, okay, 10 strings, what could that represent? Aha, the 10 Commandments. And so thinking that of the Psalter as the book of Psalms, as this kind of digest of the 10 Commandments. Now, what I find interesting about this is if you look through the Psalms, it almost never it almost never specifically mentions particular commandments. There's a lot about the righteous and about those who are wicked, and about the suffering of the righteous and the rewards of the righteous. Lots of that kind of thing in general. But there's not a lot of thou shalt not take the Lord thy God, the name of the Lord thy God in vain in the Psalms. But I think what the Psalms do is the Psalms are like a mirror, giving us, well, this is what Augustine says about them. They're the words God gives us to speak back to him. So I think they shape our very souls from the inside out. And I think that then shapes the way that we approach our duties and moral responsibilities, because they're shaped by our direct relationship with God and the words that we speak to him. But like I said, those words he himself has given us. And so there's that very closeness between that intimacy that we have with God that is the scripture would say the source of wisdom, and also the beginning of wise living. I don't know if that answers your question either, but those are just some thoughts to go on with anyway.
Excellent, Dr. Andre. Being Indian, actually, I'm a Hindu, so I love devotions. I love spirituality. Definitely, the awesome your question. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well,
there's one question. I think we'll take this last question. So translation is expression in other language, not to be deviated or manipulated from the expression in original text, which may lead to violence or unexpected consequences. If you agree with this, my question is, who can translate?
Who can translate? Yeah. So this is, it's interesting. I'm sensing that there's a particular interest in this kind of the authority of translation issue, and that someone brought up, like we said, the cultural manipulation thing. And I'm wondering, there may be things in your context specifically that I'm just not aware of that make this a particularly sensitive issue, and I hope I haven't stepped on anything. But also where it's making me slightly hesitant to speak to it, because there's so much complexity that can be associated with this. It seems like who can translate has to be partly a technical issue. Again, the who knows the languages. I don't know if you remember that one of the quotes I shared had that point of, it's anyone who has a good knowledge of these languages can translate, but also who has a knowledge of the text. So that's the second requirement. You need to know the language you're translating into, but you also need to have a deep knowledge of the text you're talking about, and not just at the word level, but at the what is its meaning level. And that could take quite a lot of study even before you translate. When it comes to scripture, and I think this would apply in any religion, any religion that allows for translation of sacred text, there also has to be a sort of, I think there is a feeling that the translation should be conducted by people who are respected for their morality, for their uprightness in that religion. Obviously, I think you don't want to make the translation dependent on that, because you never know. If you're reading someone's translation, you don't know what their life was like. You don't know what their actual personal relationship with God, their spirituality was like. But you would want it to be someone who actually believes the stuff, and who's really committed to doing it in the right spirit. So I think you have the technical knowledge, the closeness and the deep love for the text, but also I'm struggling with a word for this third thing, but really doing it in the right spirit. And I guess this kind of goes back to that machine learning question too. The first one you can totally have for a machine, and maybe even better than most people. I think, at least in England right now, I think people are getting worse and worse at learning languages. I think that's less the case in India. I think you all tend to have a stronger emphasis on language learning. But the second two, really knowing the text from the inside out and knowing what it means, and then living according to it, having it be kind of your breath when it comes to sacred texts. Those two things I don't think you can have from a machine. And so I'm not saying that a machine couldn't do translation, but I think those have to be the things you're from a person who's doing a translation, the things that you're striving towards and looking for. Yeah. I don't think it has to just be the powerful elites who are doing a translation. I think one of the things that's exciting about the Wycliffite translation is the idea that actually anybody who has those three things, whether they're in a particular position, could do this. And I think there's something valuable. I mean, I remember when I was in secondary school, just translating a text from French, just because I loved it and I wanted to get inside it, and I wanted my mother to be able to read it, and she didn't know French. And so I translated it for her. You know, nowadays, if I went back, it would not be a publishable translation. Nobody else wants to read it. And yet I think it was really formative for me. And I think that it was a good thing in our family that I did that. So, and there might be more things like that where actually kind of coterie translation could be really valuable, where you translate something for a certain group of people who would be interested to hear something from a particular person who's trusted, whether that's because they have institutional clout or whether it's because they don't. That's also a, translation from within a community is also an important thing, I think, sometimes.
That was a really great indeed. I think, we will wind up the session, and I take this honor and privilege to thank Dr. Audrey Southgate, who has made up some time for us, in fact, a lot of time to speak to us amidst your busy schedule, and patiently listen to all the questions from our end and answering all the questions. So on behalf of the Department of English, SR University, School of Sciences and Humanities, we are so grateful to you for accepting our invitation and making this wonderful presentation of your research. So thank you, Dr. Audrey Southgate, and we look forward for this collaboration further. Thank you very much. And I also thank all the participants and all those who have supported for this wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Mr. Participants, the feedback link will also be posted in the WhatsApp group, so you need not worry about it. Yes, thank you. Participants can leave the session now. Thank you very much. Have a good day.